Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this amazing talk on Saturdays here at the SSB. Still streaming online, strong and going very strong until we can get again together and truly hug one another and be physically connected. In the meantime, we'll continue to do what we can to maintain our sanity and share our blessings with one another here online. Today, we're celebrating the visit online also of our dear friend Peter HAYS from New Jersey. And in celebrating also not only this opportunity to share our takes or understanding of Spiritism, but the collaboration, right? Because when we have someone from another state, from another Spiritist center, sharing their understanding of what Spiritism can do for us, it's an amazing opportunity. And we are thankful for you, Peter. We say this up front before anything to your family as well. So we give our blessings to this amazing opportunity.
Yeah.
Talking about blessings, I would like to read a passage of the book Happy Life. For those of you who have the old version of it, it's page 85. And Joana de Angelis, through the hands of the medium Divaldo Pereira Franco, says the following: blessed with joy, every opportunity to evolve. Pain faced with resignation loses its intensity. When suffered silently, it passes more quickly. Suffering that you do not deserve will never reach you, but you will not be an exception to the rule and pass through earth without confronting it. God's law are the same for everyone. Replacing love, which is scarce, pain is the master that enforces advancement. On this note, let us celebrate this opportunity to be together once more, whether online, it's okay, and also having Peter here and pray together. You may close your eyes or not, or find a comfortable position at least that we can connect with our mentors, the mentors of our houses, whether here in Maryland, New Jersey, or anywhere we may be. Let us truly find this moment in our hearts and give thanks for this amazing moment that we have to stop, rethink about our lives, our needs, in this amazing topic that we will be sharing with one another today: family. We thank you, dear Mother, Father God, for this opportunity. We ask that you bless each one of us this afternoon into this evening, and that we can take these teachings and apply it the best way possible within our families, with our friends, share with one another as much as possible, not only through our words, but also through our deeds, our examples, our actions, and even when we are reacting to certain situations. We ask that the speaker of this evening, our brother Peter HAYS, can be a vase of love to bring us the water that will quench our thirsts, our need to evolve. This way, we ask for your blessings and permission to start this amazing moment tonight, and so be it. So before we pass the word to Peter, I would like to, as usual, to mention that our dear friend Peter Hay is a friend, right? It's someone just like us who is struggling and doing his best to be a better citizen in this amazing country, but also in the universe. And a spiritist who works as hard as possible to share these teachings. But we always have to give the let's say the official bio, so we understand what he does a little bit and his dedication to this amazing reincarnation. Peter HAYS is the president of the Spiritist group. Of Spiritist group Love and Light in New York, New Jersey. He has done lectures on Spiritism, all over the US and has participated in several US Spiritist symposiums. Besides doing over 60 episodes of the radio program Living Spring on Kardec Radio, he was on the editing staff for the Spiritist book by the US Spiritist Federation. Peter loves playing guitar, so he teaches kids and adults at Love and Light. Peter has published several children's books with his wife through their company Sem Fronteiras Press. Professionally, Peter is involved in commercial real estate. On this note, is with a huge pleasure and our hearts full of joy that I'll pass the word to Peter so he can go ahead and conduct this afternoon into the evening talk tonight. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. It is a joy to be here with all of my brothers and sisters at the Spiritist Society of Baltimore. And I'd like to spend today's lecture talking about Family School for Redemption. Our families can be such joy in our lives. We can feel absolutely blessed, perhaps, to have the family that we're in. We may feel love and support, caring, and so forth. Then again, we may be in a family that drives us absolutely crazy. We may be in a family where there's a lot of fighting, a lot of scraping, and so forth. Perhaps it's a little bit of both. But regardless of the kind of family that we're in, our families have a lot to do with our spiritual growth. If you think about it for a moment, think about some of the things that we learn through our families. A big one, of course, is love. It's one of the most important things that we can learn through our families. And I'm going to talk about this really throughout the lecture in different ways. What about patience? Well, we absolutely need to learn how to be patient in our families. That can be a big challenge. What about mentoring? Hopefully, mentoring is going on in our families. But there are a few more. Do we learn responsibility in our families? Again, hopefully, yes. If we don't, it can be very difficult. What about setting priorities within our families? Yes. In some ways, our families do make us focus on what our priorities really are. Priorities to our families are an example of that. What about nurturing? Well, of course, that's what parents should be doing, but children also learn to nurture back. We are nurtured as young when we're children, and perhaps, depending on the circumstances, when we're adults, we may be nurturing our parents, or we're nurturing siblings if we have them. What about tragedy and loss in families? Unfortunately, we're going to be going through that. That's another trial that we have to experience in being in a family. What about setting boundaries? Do we learn how to set boundaries in our family? Hopefully. If we do not learn how to set boundaries in our families, it could be quite a struggle in the world when we don't have boundaries. And what about flexibility and compromise? That's a big one. I mean, flexibility, we learn hopefully how to be flexible in our families, but we may run into members of our family who are not flexible at all. So we have to learn how to handle that. Here's some others. What about safety and security in our family? Well, we do all have a right to feel safe and secure in our family. Unfortunately, we may not, depending upon our circumstances. Do we learn how to handle risk in our families? Yes, depending on the circumstances, depending upon what the risk is. That could be going on. What about bonding? Bonding is essential in our families. It is very, very important that children, from the time they're born up through the first 5 years and really beyond, but certainly in the very beginning of our lives, it is important that all of us be able to bond with our parents. And when there isn't proper bonding between parents and children. It can often be one of the big issues that people face in terms of emotional issues. What about acquiring useful and productive skills? Well, depending upon the kind of family we have, we may have members of our family who are very skilled in a variety of tasks. There's certainly the domestic skills that we are hopefully learning, but we may also be have some parents who are very talented in other areas, and so we may learn through them first. That may be a source of inspiration. What about betrayal? Do we experience betrayal in our families? Hopefully not, but unfortunately that too could be a possibility, and that is certainly a big trial. What about communication in our families? That's a big one. Families that don't communicate very well are obviously going to have a big problem. When families can communicate very well, it can lead to relieving a lot of tension and certainly go a long way to creating harmony, fraternity, and happiness within a family. Do our families inspire us? Are they sources of inspiration? Yes, in all sorts of ways they can be. Both positive and in negative ways, I should say. Sometimes many artists, for instance, have written amazing works or created amazing works because they came from families that were not so happy. And that, unfortunately, was their source of inspiration. But it can also go the other way, of course. Our families may be incredibly inspiring to us in all sorts of positive ways. And sometimes if we're able to accomplish a lot of things in life that are rewarding to us personally and perhaps very helpful to others, it may be because we learned a great deal from our families and they inspired us. So as you can see, there's lots of trials that we can go through. I can mention a few others. What about physical and mental illness? Usually, one way or another, we're going to be experiencing physical illness in our families, and there are some certainly that have mental illness or both. And so that's another challenge. Do we learn flexibility and compromise? Yes, I mentioned that one before, but you get the idea. All of these are examples of trials. In the Gospel according to Spiritism, St. Augustine in chapter 14, item 9, emphasizes to us that the trials that afflict the heart are the hardest trials of all. And certainly we go through many trials that afflict the heart within our families. But the more they afflict our heart, the bigger the trial is, as it were, could be a sign that that trial is coming to an end. And so there is at least hope with this. But the other thing I want to emphasize is that what we're going through in terms of trials through our family are a product of the process of reincarnation. This is how Spiritism explains the nature of our existence. And reincarnation is really the vehicle and the reason why when we say family is a school of redemption, the subject of today's lecture, it's because of reincarnation. I'll repeat that. Reincarnation, because of reincarnation, this is why family can become a school for redemption, or a school for souls, a school for spiritual growth, because of these examples and so many more. I'm sure many of you could come up with your own examples of the things that you learn through your families. And yet, why is reincarnation such a big deal? Well, families, I should say, are the primary vehicle. They direct the focus and the purpose of reincarnation. So once again, families are the vehicle that direct the focus and purpose of reincarnation. But why does reincarnation matter so much to begin with? Well, I'm going to spend a moment or two and focus on some basic ideas behind Spiritism that have more to do with families. When we think about the basic purpose of reincarnation, if you look at question 167 in the Spirit's book, question 167 points out to us that the purpose of reincarnation is atonement and the progressive betterment of humankind, and that without this there would be no justice. So part of God's justice is that we all must go through a progressive growth. And yet, why justice? Why is that such an issue? Well, in question 171, it points out that reincarnation is based on God's justice, and it's kind of like this. It refers to question 171 tells us that God is like a understanding parent, an affectionate parent who's always going to give children, his or her children, an opportunity to redeem themselves. So no matter how much we may succeed or not succeed in our lives, we will have another opportunity. And in addition to that, it points out that spirits strive for perfection, all spirits, even when spirits are rebellious. And the spirit may be rebellious for some time and or stay in the same place for quite a while. One way or another, all of us strive for perfection. Children do the same thing. A lot of times children, they don't strive for perfection, but they do want to please. We have this sort of instinctive desire for spiritual progress. Also, one of the basic reasons that families exist in the first place is because we human beings are social animals. And so we need interaction with others. We need to be involved with others, and that's how we learn. And families, of course, are the way that make that possible. And this is touched on in Family Ties, which is chapter 7 in part 3 of the Spirit's book, and under the social law. And it's very important that we keep in mind that family ties are what bind all of us together. And what it does is it starts to make a general point. This is one very important point. We often, when we think about family, we think about biological ties, right? We were born into the family, so what choice do we have? But what about the spiritual ties within a family? Well, question 203 in the Spirit's book makes an important point, which is that parents, first of all, that the soul is indivisible, and that parents are only providing biological life. They're not transferring part of their soul to their children. And therefore, this implies that spiritual ties are deeper and more profound than the biological ties. That does not mean that biological ties don't count. They do. Often, our biological connection to one another is a source for emotional bonding between people. Think about our ethnic identity, for instance. These days, of course, you can do a DNA test and you can find out a little bit about our actual biological background, our ethnic background, and so forth. But also, when we think about families and biological ties and so forth, one of the things we may focus on might be our ancestors. We may be very, depending upon the family we come from, we may know a lot about our ancestors. I know a fair amount about my ancestors. Fairly recently, I came across a lot of information that I got from my grandparents, and I know a fair amount about my family going back a good 5 generations or more. Sometimes people have ancestors who are well known and they may like to comment on that. But in a way, from a Spiritist perspective, that also misses the point. Because when we think about our biological ancestors, really what's more important, if we want to celebrate them, is to think about how to emulate their good qualities. Again, that's stressing a spiritual tie versus a biological tie. If we know anything about our ancestors, it might be informative to us. I could easily talk about my family for the entire lecture, and I'm not going to do that. I will mention very quickly that I found it interesting that all 4 of my great-grandparents, my great-grandmothers, were very religious. And there's actually a lot of connections like that. And there's many other things that I've noticed, which I won't focus on right now. But if any of us look back into our families and we know anything about our ancestors, it might help inform us a little bit. If nothing else, we may be learning some of the, we hope to emulate the good qualities of our ancestors, but depending on the ancestors we have, we may also be wanting to avoid some of our ancestors' behavior, and we can be thankful for that as well. Family ties and this idea of spiritual ties is talked about, of course, in the gospel according to Spiritism, and it's really an important one. In the gospel according to Spiritism, in chapter 4, the question has been brought up, is reincarnation actually bad for family ties? Is it the opposite of what one might think? But it says no, that reincarnation strengthens family ties because spirits are bound together by affection, feelings of empathy, similar interest, and ideas. And in fact, sometimes spirits will follow each other into the incarnate life and unite on earth in the same family or the same circle of friends and acquaintances. And through these relationships, they can help one another to progress. This certainly is emphasizing how important spiritual ties are and that they are ongoing. With biological ties, they don't, they're temporary, right? So, but the spiritual ties, the emotional ties to the variety of relationships we might have with members of our family, with friends, even with neighbors, perhaps, whatever it is, these are all spiritual ties and they're ongoing. And families and the way families are formed are often influenced or as a result of this, because these relationships could be going on from one life to the next. In fact, I'll say more about this in different ways, but the book Action and Reaction, the Andre Luiz book, certainly emphasizes a lot that we all have to pay off whatever debts we have, every last one of them, one way or another. And it is through our families and through our friendships and through these ongoing spiritual ties that we have the opportunity to do this. That, by the way, is one of the big themes of today's lecture. In question 204, it builds on the same ideas that I talked about from the Gospel according to Spiritism, because in question 204, it says that the succession of physical lives obviously establish a variety of relationships. And they not only can date back to former lives, when we look at the kind of relationships we have with people within our family, with our friends, and so forth, they may be a sign of something that happened in a former lives or previous lives. And the nature of those relationships may explain why we sometimes have empathy or aversion to individuals, or maybe a little bit of both. And sometimes we think we're meeting someone for the very first time, and yet if we've all noticed this, I'm sure, where you meet somebody and you immediately connect with them, and others you've met or you meet and you just never really connected with them, or you don't. And this certainly happens in families, where sometimes we're very close to members of our families, particular members of our families, and others we just never really bonded or connected with them. And if we think about it, did something happen that we remember now in the current life that caused that? Well, maybe, but what if it didn't? What if it's just there? It's just something that was always the nature of that relationship, and it's kind of puzzling. Why don't I get along with so-and-so in my family? Well, it can be because of stuff that happened in the past, which we are not remembering. And a lot of this, and all of it really, is connected to the nature of affinity and magnetism. Spiritism talks a lot about affinity of spirits, affinity between spirits. And if you look at the definitions of affinity, they're interesting. These are some definitions from the Webster Dictionary. For instance, the first one is just relationship by marriage. So that implies that if affinity is like a marriage, that means it's obviously strong. And then this next definition is more of a scientific one: an attractive force between substances or particles that causes them to enter into and remain in chemical combination. We think about this in terms of the relationship between spirits. There's this kind of attraction, bond between spirits. I'll say more about that pretty soon. And then another definition is an attraction to or liking for something. So again, affinity is connected to the word attraction. And if we think about the opposite meanings of affinity, well, before I get to that, affinity implies a susceptibility or predisposition on the part of the one drawn. In other words, depending upon our personality, our emotional makeup, if you will, depending upon what we have within us, what makes up our personality, we have certain predispositions that may cause us to have a stronger affinity with certain individuals. And that can be positive, but it can also be negative. When you think about relationships, especially partnerships between couples, marriages, and so forth, people will get together for positive reasons, husband and wives, or boyfriend, girlfriend, or partners, whatever it is. They may get together for positive reasons, but they also may be getting together for some negative reasons too. Sometimes, depending upon what we're predisposed to, we may be attracting people into our lives in relationships that are not so positive, because that's what we're attracting, and we need to work on that. And that is a function of magnetism. But it's also an example of how affinity, which is an attractive force, can also be the opposite. We may attract, as it were, ourselves into relationships in which there's inversion or indifference or dislike. We may, what if we're the type of people, for instance, that we tend to attract those who are indifferent to us, or we tend to get into antagonistic relationships. Some people are like that, right? Some people like to fight, for instance. And so these are qualities of our personality that can also have to do with magnetism. And the consequence of affinity or aversion is driven by magnetism. I'm going to, again, elaborate on this a little bit more soon. But magnetism is a force that spirits are interacting with, and they can be, depending upon the personality of the spirits will have affinity with each other. And again, that affinity can be positive or not so positive. Unfortunately, people sometimes, as I've been suggesting, get into relationships that are not very healthy with one another because it's driven by magnetism. Now, when we think about that sort of thing going on in our family, this next idea may be a little hard to take, because as part of the reincarnation process, depending upon how elevated a spirit is, we may very likely be choosing the family we're going to be into. We're planning, we're making some choices. Certain spirits want to be in a certain particular family. They may need to be in a particular family. And some of us may go, are you kidding? Oh my God, that family? Oh, no, don't do that to me. But as St. Augustine has pointed out in chapter 19, item 9, and elsewhere, if we have a difficult relationship or a trial that we have to face within our families, we can see it, certainly as a trial, it is, but we can also see it as an opportunity. It's an opportunity for growth. St. Augustine is very clear about this in the Gospel. St. Augustine emphasizes that, yes, trials are difficult, they're challenging. If we know ahead of time what the trial might be, we don't really look forward to it. But remember, basic point in Spiritism, God does not give us anything we can't handle. And more importantly here is going through a difficult trial is not about learning how to be a masochist. It is about appreciating that if I can get through a difficult trial, it's a victory. So it's really a cause for celebration. St. Francis had this attitude that if he went through something that was challenging, he was thankful for it. And again, this is not about being masochistic or abusive. It is about learning how resilient we really are. And our families, depending upon the family we have, can teach us a lot about how to be very resilient in all kinds of ways, both positive and not so positive ways. So all of this is examples of the ways in which our families can teach us a lot through the process of reincarnation. And reincarnation also puts our families into a much larger perspective. And I'm going to kind of rephrase it this way. Our families are like a stage through which the process of reincarnation is going to occur. Again, our families are like a big stage in which the process of reincarnation is going to occur. In other words, the dramas that we go through the trials that we have to undertake, is happening, at least in the beginning, through our families. And our families play a big role in that. And this applies even if someone's an orphan and doesn't really either didn't know their biological parents, or you could say, I don't really have a family. Well, if somebody is in that situation, that's still a trial. So whether we're within a family or technically in some way, maybe not within a family, in a foster environment of some kind, then we're still going through trials that are a result of our relationship to family. Family is a general concept. And again, reincarnation is bringing this about. It's the family is the structure that allows for reincarnation to be effective, or perhaps not so effective. And I'm going to spend some time giving an example of pretty much everything I've been talking about up to this point. This is from the book Missionaries of the Light by Andre Luiz. Missionaries of the Light talks a lot about the process of reincarnation. And in this book, Andre Luiz is observing examples of what happens when spirits go through the process of reincarnation. And there's a story in this book, which I'm going to spend some time on now, which illustrates a lot of the things I've been talking about and is a very interesting story. It is essentially has to do with these three individuals: Raquel, Adelino, and Segismundo. And what happens is this: Andre Luiz gets to observe what's going on with these three individuals. At the time that Missionaries of the Light is set, in the 1950s, Adelino and Raquel are in the incarnate world. They're husband and wife. They live have a nice home, and they have one child named Joao. And Raquel and Adelino have married roughly 4 years before, and they have a young child. And now they are in a place where they could have a second child. Actually, what happened was that in the spirit world, that was the plan, to have 2 children. And the second child was going to be Segismundo. Segismundo is still a spirit in the spirit world. And he's very troubled, and he's very upset. And the reason is this: he needs to incarnate into this family of Adelino and Raquel. And it has to be that family, because he's got some stuff he needs to work on. But there are problems with this. And the one who explains it to us is Alexandre. Alexandre is the mentor spirit in this book, who Andre Luiz accompanies. And Alexandre is the one who's often the source of information. If you're familiar with the Andre Luiz books, a lot of them, they have usually there's a mentor spirit who Andre and whoever is with him, like Ilario, for instance, in some of the books. When Andre spends time with a mentor spirit, that mentor spirit is often the source of information and wisdom. And so Alexandre plays that role in this particular book. And Alexandre is explaining the problem that's going on between Raquel, Adelino, and Segismundo. The reason Alexandre knows something about this is because he knew them in their last incarnation when they were all on Earth together. This would have been in the middle of the 19th century. So Alexandre has been asked to come into this particular case and help Segismundo. Alexandre, of course, knows Segismundo. He knew Raquel and Adelino in their prior incarnation together. And Segismundo's very discouraged. And the question would then be, why? What happened? Well, Alexandre explains that in their prior incarnation, which this would be like the middle of the 19th century in Brazil, what happened was that Adelino and Raquel were husband and wife. Raquel had an affair with Segismundo. Adelino finds out, gets very upset, and he challenges Segismundo to a duel. Segismundo kills Adelino in that duel. And then Segismundo, well, in theory at least, he's and Raquel can now be together because they had a very passionate romance. But it turns out that Segismundo was probably, was more interested in Raquel sexually, and his capacity to have an ongoing, long-term emotional relationship with her had its limitations. But also, he killed Adelino in a duel, so he's now a criminal. So the situation is not good. And what finally happens is that Segismundo, when he finally has Raquel in his life and Adelino is gone, he abandons her. Raquel is humiliated. Remember, this is the middle of the 19th century. She had an affair. People know about it. So she was disgraced, got her husband killed. No doubt he was very proud, and he felt humiliated as anybody who's the object of an unfaithful relationship would be. And so Raquel, who's now disgraced by society and so forth, winds up in a life of prostitution. And when she finally dies, she's very, very angry and bitter. Adelino, who of course died as a result of the duel, is angry and bitter. And when Segismundo finally dies, he too is very angry and bitter. So all three of these spirits, Raquel, Adelino, Segismundo, are suffering in the spirit world, and they're very upset and bitter. And then eventually they get some help. They get help from friends who are more elevated than they are, people like Alexandre, and they are able to get out of the umbral that they're in, the lower zones, to use the English translation of umbral. And what then happens is that finally they are at a point where they can begin to make plans for the next incarnation. And the agreement was that Segismundo would come back as the son of Raquel and Adelino, that Raquel and Adelino would have another opportunity to be husband and wife. Well, that's all very well and good, but in the present, there's a problem. When Adelino, and Alexandre explains this to us, when Adelino goes to sleep at night, his spirit is free, and his energy is such that he still has this rage and this anger from being murdered in a duel. He has no idea. He does not remember the duel. He just feels this anger and this rage, and he feels fearful. He feels fearful when he's out of his body. And this is because Segismundo's near him, hoping that he can connect with Adelino and incarnate into this family. But Adelino's anger is so intense that his energy, his magnetism, if you will, is repelling Segismundo. Segismundo can feel being repelled by Adelino, and it really drives him, well, it makes him very sad and upset and discouraged. And he's thinking, this is never going to work. So Alexandre is going, well, we have to help. So what happens next? Well, Alexandre is going to go into the family of Raquel and Adelino. He's going to visit. And what happens is that when Alexandre, who's joined by Andre Luiz, because Andre wants to have a chance to observe what happens here, and he's allowed to. So what happens is that Alexandre is with Segismundo, who's in the home of Adelino and Raquel. And there's a scene in the book where Adelino and Raquel are having dinner. And they're with their only child, who is Joao. Now, Joao is a very spiritual kid for someone who's very young, 4, 5 years old, somewhere in there. And what's happening in this moment in the book is that Adelino has been in a weird mood lately. He's been kind of grumpy, quiet, not very communicative, and Raquel can sense this and sees it. He says it has to do with work. The assumption is that he's, having troubles with work. He's not very talkative with his wife. Well, Alexandre's observing that, and he realizes something has to be done here. And he sees and understands that their son, Joao, who prays with his mother and has a connection and a bond with his mother that's very spiritual in many ways. Well, that's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for Alexandre to be able to reach Raquel and Adelino, and in particular Adelino. So what happens is that through magnetism, Alexandre manipulates energy and inspires Joao, their son, to take notice of Daddy. And he says to him, Daddy, why are you upset? What's the matter? And then when his own son points out to him that he's looking kind of grumpy, it makes Adelino think, oh, yes, okay. Gosh, I am kind of grumpy, aren't I? And then he says a little bit more. And then finally, Joao, their child, asks his father if he would join him and mom to the next evening to pray with them. Again, this is all part of Joao's personality, but it's Alexandre's using magnetism to kind of gently finesse, if you will, this suggestion, so that Joao invites his father to pray with him and his mom. Adelino agrees. He comes back the next day and he prays. And the environment in this family starts to improve. It starts to get a little better. Again, the stage is starting to get set for what happens next. What happens next is that evening, things between Raquel and Adelino are a little better. And they both go to sleep and they dream. When they dream, they go out of their bodies. If you look at this image, you'll see they're attached to the silver cord. So obviously their spirits are having out-of-body experience. And Raquel, who has had more than one, she and Adelino have been together more than once before. They had a relationship in the prior incarnation that I mentioned, but even before that, they had been together. And Raquel, for a variety of reasons, is a little more spiritually advanced than her husband. This, by the way, is often common in partnerships, that sometimes one partner is a little more advanced spiritually, or perhaps a little more responsible for the relationship in some ways. And Raquel, when she goes out of her body, she meets her mother. You see her in the screen. And her mother and she are happy to be reunited. And so they spend some time together. And their vibration, the level of vibration, the way their spirits vibrate is different than her husband. So because of that, Raquel can't see her husband while she's out of her body. And just as well. She's with her mother. She's fine. They're going to pray and spend some time together because Raquel's pretty spiritual in many ways. Adelino, when he goes out of his body, he's kind of shaky. He's not only shaky, but he's rather fearful. And when Adelino is walking around, he feels this hesitancy. Why? Because Segismundo's nearby. And Segismundo's with Alexandre and Andre Luiz. And this has been arranged because Alexandre is going to arrange for a meeting between Segismundo and Alexandre. Adelino, I'm sorry. So Alexandre appears before Adelino. He adjusts the vibration of his spirit so that Adelino can see him. And Alexandre tries to convince Adelino that it's very important for him to be able to forgive, that he needs to be able to forgive in general, to be loving. And Adelino admits that he feels uneasy at the moment. Something is bothering him. He feels like he doesn't know, really. He doesn't know. He thinks that someone may be trying to kill him, or someone's going to take something away from him. And that's him reacting energetically to the presence of Segismundo. So Alexandre finally persuades Adelino that it's okay. And he then introduces Segismundo to Adelino. This union between these two. Remember, Segismundo killed Adelino in a duel. So there's a big problem between these two. And Segismundo cheated with his wife. So Segismundo feels badly about this. He's had a lot of time to reflect on this, and he asked for forgiveness. He asked to apologize, asked for apologies and everything. And Segismundo, and he has to be able to do this. So he finally pleads with Adelino and begs him to forgive him and to accept him as a friend. Remember, Adelino doesn't remember the duel, and he doesn't need to remember the duel. This is important because Adelino just has to be able to forgive this guy. Not consciously forgiving him. He's forgiving him by merely accepting him as a person and accepting him as a brother. And that's what Alexandre is trying to arrange. He doesn't need to tell Adelino, oh, by the way, this guy killed you in a duel. No, that wouldn't work. And Alexandre understands that. So he's very careful here. What he does is he basically arranges it so that Segismundo and Adelino can meet and be comfortable with each other. And then Andre Luiz notices something really amazing. The minute Adelino says, with sincerity, that he will accept Segismundo as his brother, Andre Luiz is watching Adelino, and he sees a kind of cloud release from Adelino's spirit. It's his paraspirit releasing some of that anger and all that rage that he's had. Anger and rage that he's not really aware of on many levels. But it's a release. And that frees him because it changes the environment between him and the presence of Segismundo. It's possible that these two might be able to heal with each other. And so because of this encounter, they, Adelino and Raquel, wake up from their dream. They remember a little bit of their dream. It was a vivid dream, but they don't remember everything. A lot of times we don't. And sometimes there are very good reasons for that. But the fact that they woke up, the fact that this encounter happened between Adelino and Segismundo, that sets the stage, if you will, for what happens next. Things between Raquel and Adelino are better. They're more closer to each other as husband and wife. And as a result, Raquel is able to get pregnant again. And there's an interesting thing that happens that's pointed out in the book here. Alexandre, this mentor spirit, along with other more advanced spirits, actually use magnetism and energy to kind of make sure that, shall we say, the right sperm from Adelino fertilizes Raquel's egg, because of all the thousands of sperms that are produced from semen from the male. Need only one to fertilize the egg, right? But which one? Well, they made sure the right sperm fertilized her egg. In other words, they were trying to ensure they weren't interfering with the biological process. They were simply gently encouraging the best outcome possible. Let's put it that way. And as a result of that, Raquel is able to get pregnant. Why did they do all that? Well, the book makes a very important point. Adelino was so full of rage at being betrayed, at being murdered in the duel. He had all this pent-up anger. He could not conceive. He was able to conceive Joao, but the next child was going to be the one he really had a problem with. And unconsciously, deep down, he somehow knew this because he made a promise in the spirit world that he was going to be the father of this guy. And as is pointed out in this book, we often are brave in the spirit world. We make these promises of what who we're going to have in our families, who we're going to be in relationships with. But then when we come back and we're in the incarnate world, we get a little comfortable in our situation and we don't fulfill everything that we promised in the spirit world. And instinctively, there was something about, well, instinctively, let's put it this way, Adelino and Raquel, like many couples, certainly wanted and needed or talked about having another child, but it wasn't happening. And not only was it not happening, but even if they were trying to have a child, it was not likely that he was going to conceive. Now, does that happen to all parents? If they're full of rage and anger, they can't conceive? No, that's very simplistic. But in this particular case with Adelino, it was an issue. But anyways, things work out. Raquel gets pregnant, and 9 months later, first of all, this image shows that Segismundo is going to contract. His spirit is contracting. He's preparing for the process of reincarnation. And then Segismundo is born as the second child of Adelino and Raquel. And so the beauty of this whole story is that these were three spirits who were full of anger and bitterness, and they were in the lower zones for a long time, and they suffered a great deal. And then they got out of there. They got help. And now, as a family, through the family, they have an opportunity to reconcile as a loving family. Are they going to succeed? Well, they're going to have their work cut out for them on a number of levels. First of all, Raquel and Adelino have to be loving parents. It is the child's right to have unconditional love from their parents. Very important. I talked about bonding earlier in this lecture that needs to happen between parents and children. When there's healthy bonding, it makes a world of difference. Doesn't always work out that way, of course, but that's the ideal, is that there's healthy bonding. So they have to treat Segismundo with kindness, even if they may have problems with him sometimes. And Segismundo also has to do his part, which I'll comment more on in a moment, but I want to make another point, which is, think about this for a moment. In terms of, and this isn't a point about the way reincarnation, the wisdom of reincarnation. Suppose that Segismundo came back and he was the husband of Raquel. And so suppose Raquel and Segismundo were husband and wife, and it was Adelino that came back as a child. Would that work? Well, here's the thing. Adelino has to be able to forgive. Forgiveness is a huge, huge trial in this family. It is much easier for Adelino as a parent to be more forgiving of his child, because he should learn to love his son unconditionally, even when they have problems with each other. And one can guess they probably will sometimes, but hopefully not too much. And so in order for the trial of forgiveness to be more effective, it's better that Adelino is the father and Segismundo is the son. But Segismundo has to do his part. Segismundo, first of all, the gospel points out that it is very important for children to love their parents, and children need to honor and respect their parents. And keep in mind, in their prior incarnation, Segismundo did not respect the relationship. between the marriage of Raquel and Adelino because he got involved with Raquel. And he knew they were married. He knew her situation. And so as a result of that, now as a child, he has to learn respect for parents on a variety of emotional levels. Because the gospel makes a very important point. The gospel says that an inability to love our parents would almost suggest an inability to love anyone or anything. So children who really don't love their parents at all, that is a miserable way to go through life. And so it is so important that, again, we have an environment in which there's love is able to thrive within a family. And an important point that's made is that, and this is made by St. Augustine, in the Gospel according to Spiritism, chapter 14, item 19 or item 9, St. Augustine emphasizes that the path to God requires only one password, as it were, charity, or love, if you will. Depends on the translation of the gospel you have. Sometimes it's translated as love, but charity. And that charity, in order to be charitable, it requires forgiveness. And if we have hatred in our hearts and we don't have forgiveness, well, how can you have charity? So you need to be able to free ourselves up, as it were, by learning how to be more charitable toward one another, how to accept one another. And so one of the questions to ask is, are they going to succeed? Well, we don't know. We don't find out. The book doesn't tell us. But they've got a lot of things going in their favor. Everything I just mentioned, in terms of the configuration of the relationships, is helpful. Joao, the younger child, who's very spiritual, can help. He's there for a reason. And so even if Adelino is perhaps a little more rebellious than Joao, that remains to be seen, there's still the opportunity within this family for things to work out. And this is important because it's one example of how, generally speaking, in our families, we all have a role within our family, and we all have, therefore, certain responsibilities to our family. And the more we can be aware of what we're responsible for in our family and what we're not so responsible for in our family, the easier it is for us to have a more successful family environment. And also in terms of the trials that we go through via reincarnation, it helps if we understand as best we can our responsibilities within our families, where they begin, where they end, and so forth. And I'm going to start to wrap up, but St. Augustine does have some interesting and again, very profound points to make to parents in particular, but just in general about the nature of reincarnation, but also how it pertains to family ties, for instance. And St. Augustine, in the Gospel according to Spiritism, points out to us that the soul incarnates for one purpose, and that's spiritual advancement. That's primarily it. And if parents can understand that the soul incarnates for one purpose only, spiritual advancement, then it can help them to really understand the responsibility they have toward their children. This is mentioned in chapter 14, item 9, but also in question 207 of the Spirit's book. It comments on this same idea, which is that when parents understand their responsibility they have toward their children, they can help to bring their children closer to God. And when parents neglect this obligation, this responsibility, well, unfortunately, there can be consequences. When I said earlier, question 203 it was, that parents provide biological life for their children and that parents are not transferring part of their souls, I certainly did not mean to suggest that parents don't play a big role in the upbringing of their children. They do, of course. And question 207 of the Spirit's book emphasizes that, and that parents have a mission In fact, for many of us, if we are parents, it may be the most important mission we have in our lives toward our family, toward our children, and so forth during the time that we're actively involved as parents. Of course, as children grow up, they become more independent. Well, it depends on the circumstances, of course, but on what's going on with the child. But generally, as a general comment, parents have to accept this responsibility. And if they don't, they can be held accountable. I'm going to conclude by just saying that, again, we need to understand our responsibility within our families. And the more we can do that, the more we have consciousness about that, the more we can try to help facilitate love. I mentioned in the beginning that we certainly are hopefully learning how to love in our family. It's obviously crucial. Love and compassion are the most important things that any of us should be trying to fulfill in our lives as much as we can. And I say that because some people struggle with that. Some people find it hard to be loving. And there are families that are not very loving. But hopefully one is in a family that is loving. Or maybe it's a mix. Maybe they care more about each other than they express. That often happens too in families where people may they do care, but they don't express it very well. So people don't feel like they're loved in their families. And all these and much, much more are some of the examples of the trials that we go through in our families. And just a couple of other quick points. Yes, parents have a responsibility to their children, but parents are not expected to be perfect. And I'm not suggesting they have to be by any means. There's no such thing as a perfect parent. All parents make mistakes. All parents are not going to do everything right. You don't need to have a perfect family, whatever that might mean. I mean, who knows what? But anyways, I'd say pretty much how many families out there are actually perfect? Probably not too many. But that's part of the trial that we go through, since none of us are perfect, none of us are saints. And therefore, we're not expected to be perfect. Parents are not expected to be perfect, but they can try to do their best to at least be more mindful about the position they have. And because the parents are the ones that set the tone in the family. And it's up to all members of the family, hopefully, are able to support one another in various ways. It's how we all grow spiritually. It's how family ties are strengthened and how they can continue, because we're always planting seeds for the future. And just the last thing I want to say is this is a book I recommend. Found it useful years ago when our son was small, my wife Betty and I's son. It's part of a program called the STEP program, which is strategic training for effective parenting. And it's got a variety of techniques. I believe you can still get this book on Amazon. This book does things, it has examples in it, like, for instance, reflective listening, where you learn how to actually respond or listen to what your children are expressing and how they're expressing, how to acknowledge what their children are going through, even if they're not going to get their way, things like that. It's basically, it teaches a lot of things, but one of the things it helps parents with is how to set boundaries with their children. And this can be useful even after children are already there in the family, or if parents are planning, future parents, as it were, maybe they might want to look at a book like this before they have children, so they've had some time to reflect on these things. Anyway, I thank you all for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and may God bless you all.
Peter, thank you so much for this amazing talk. We're very happy to have these reminders for some of us. What you shared here tonight is an amazing story as well. I can't thank you enough. There are many pointers here that I was taking notes as you were sharing this with us. So thank you, thank you, thank you. There are a lot of comments. There are a lot of There's several questions here that we would like to share. One thing that it really struck me towards the end now that you mentioned about the responsibility that we have to really look into it, right? Each one of us, and the taking that step. We know that many of us don't think directly, okay, what's my responsibility? But we see within our family gatherings, right, our friends as well, that they understand that responsibility by the way they act with us, caring for us, doing the things that they can do in their level. And I start feeling that great sense of gratitude for these individuals, whether the wife, mother, father, brothers and sisters, and even my kids, because they do what they can, in their level of understanding. So it's just an amazing feeling that, these teachings, these reminders that you shared with us has brought to us. So thank you for that. On that note, I would like to go here and kind of go over. I do apologize, everyone, but for the greetings, I will try to skip that so we can go straight into the questions and comments that we had. There are many individuals from the SSB and some of outside of the SSB as well who had give their greetings, saying good evening. And thanking you for being here as well, Peter. So I don't want to discount that, but it's important that we go straight to the comments that we have, and this will also allow us to go into some of the topics that you mentioned and you shared here with us.
Okay.
I will start with Kirsten when she said, in the family setting is where most of our relationship understanding coming from and become our point of reference, which can be a good or bad thing, right? And it is so true that we go through the ups and downs. And I think it was amazing the way that you also brought all the different things that we go through, with family members, right, in the family setting. So. And then on that note, Regina mentioned, I always thank my kids for having accepted me as their mom, right? And then Kirsten validated that, saying that I like that perspective. But it's a very interesting way to see and understand our purpose in life, right? Saying, look, thank you for allowing me to be a father, or thank you for allowing me to be a mother, brother and sister, or even a son. But it's just, we always in demanding mode, right? For me. But then when we flip the coin, we say, wow, they accepted me.
I think parents learn probably a lot more from their children on many levels than children may learn from their parents.
Yes.
So,
and after Kirsten said that, this is exactly one of the things that Regina also said, that my kids have been my best teachers.
Yeah.
So it's so true.
True. Yeah.
Practicing patience, right? And by the way, Peter, if please jump in as as we go start reading, as we are reading these comments. Please, if you want to say something, let me know, or just go on and say it. And then Kirsten actually asked a question: isn't it better, Peter, for us to not know the backstory of our previous lives with our current family members? Otherwise, we would become disturbed.
Well, absolutely. Spiritism stresses this a lot. Even though Spiritism strongly talks a lot about reincarnation, that does not mean that it's good for us to know everything that happened in the past. Because if we knew everything that we may have done, well, some of it may be pretty hard to take. And if we knew everything that had happened between us and the person we're close to, it may be extremely difficult to function. So having those blinders on is very, very important. Again, Spiritism is not a big one on past life regressions and stuff like that. It depends. There may be certain circumstances where that might be informative or useful, but that's more the exception rather than the rule. And a lot of times if we and part of the reason for that is because we have enough going on right now in the immediate here and now, and being in the here and nows is where our focus needs to be. We shouldn't be fixating on the past, which can be debilitating, or obsessing about the future, which we don't have control over and can also be debilitating. If we are more in the present, then it helps us to just basically handle what we can handle rather than worrying about the things we don't have control over. We can't undo the past, and we don't really have control over the future. We can plant seeds for the future, but it's a lot easier to plant seeds for the future when we focus on the here and now.
And I would like to. I know we have posed a question there from Paula, but I would like to ask a follow-up question on this. And I know you mentioned, Peter, about the magnetism, right? The good and the bad that comes from the past. Now, what if we do have a strong indication of one individual or a group of individuals that are in our families, whether direct family members or not, is part of our past? How should we, in practical ways, because I know it all depends on the situation and what happens. In practical ways, what would you say would be the best way to proceed with that feeling that we have inside of us, whether with a good thing or a bad situation?
You mean if there's a lot of energy, as it were, between two people?
Yeah, if we get a strong indications within ourselves that is something from the past, yes.
If we have that strong indication, I would think the thing to do is try to understand what's going on at the moment. What sort of tensions do I have with this person? And is there some way to communicate to try to ease whatever those tensions are? And sometimes we can, and sometimes we can't. If it's possible, if therapy would be useful, that's one option. Just learning how to communicate better. Sometimes we may, and perhaps find ways that are not combative or aggressive, may say to someone in our family, I always feel like you have this feeling about me, or you have this attitude about me, and maybe give them the benefit of the doubt and ask them if that's really how they feel. Because a lot of times we're projecting onto people. We think we know what they're thinking, or we think they have a certain attitude towards us, but it may be distortion. It may be saying more about us than it is about them. That's a possibility. But just if we can talk to people in our family and do it in a way that's not combative. It's not about trying to win the argument, I'm right, you're wrong kind of thing. We have to, when I mentioned reflective listening before in the book, the STEP book, reflective listening in part also means really listening to somebody else. So if this is going on between two adults, we need to acknowledge what the other person's feeling, especially if they're saying things about our behavior, which may be hard for us to take, but we have to have enough courage and humility to realize that they may be right, and maybe we behave in ways that are um, troubling for others, and we may not be aware of it. And so sometimes people will say, you do this and you do that, or I feel you do such and such, and we kind of go, oh yeah, okay, sorry.
Right. Thank you. That's an amazing answer. Thank you. Yes, sometimes the problem's within us, and we're putting on someone else, right?
And
So
these broad comments, but yeah.
yes. So moving on, Paula Smith actually asked, fewer children are being born in Western countries than in the past. Sign of souls evolving off the planet, or and then I'm just going to read the follow up here, kind of questions and answer. Paula, that's a great question. I wonder if this is also has anything to do with the larger availability of birth control contraceptives. There is a definite decline in the teenage pregnancies, which is good. So, we can go off of these, obviously, mainly the question that Paula presented,
Okay.
and then the follow up that Kirsten brought as well.
So fewer births, in other words. Okay. Oh, I see. So Kirsten responded to it.
Right.
Okay. Well, yes. the declining birth rate can certainly be certainly, I think, a sign of more of contraception to some extent, and certainly family planning. There's more awareness of it now. Um, I mean, just to make a point that's probably pretty obvious if anyone has looked at history, but I mentioned earlier that I more recently discovered a lot more information about my ancestors and my family. And I was looking at a list of the children in one of those, like my great great grandparents' family, and there were like 8 or 9 kids. And that was the norm to have that many kids. And at least 2 or 3 of them didn't live much past the age of 5 or younger, or they died in infancy. So, because of all the medical advances we have, plus the awareness, so this is an example of using our intelligence, and to some extent even also our morality too, I would say, because if we think about the nature of family planning, um, it's well, I'll try to put it this way. In the laws in the Ten Commandments that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai, one of them is do not commit adultery. If you think about it, okay, why is that was so serious? Well, if everybody is wanting to be with whoever they want in terms of relationships, sexual relationships, you can imagine how many unwanted children were born back then. It was might have been in certain worlds a free for all, as it were. And part of our moral development is that we learn, yes, we need to plan. We need to think about what we're doing here. If when 2 people choose to get married, they make all kinds of complicated decisions about that, which these days are more encouraged. It's not that people didn't think about that before, but people have more choices now. People can choose to get married or not get married. And if people don't get married, they're not ostracized necessarily in the same way. And obviously, because of birth control, it's given all kinds of options for women. Um, uh, I could say more about that, but the point being is that these kinds of scientific advancements have given us more options than we had before. And we live in a time where it is more acceptable to talk about a lot of things more openly than was, than most people were comfortable with in the past.
So, because of time, thank you again, Peter. Because of time, we will continue to go straight into the questions. There are several and amazing comments that I would love to go over here as you were speaking with us too. But the next question that I would like to share, it comes from Alba Morales. From the Spiritist point of view, what would be the responsibilities, duties of the children towards their parents, i.e., when parents are old and children adults?
Yes, the gospel, according to Spiritism, talks about that. The children need to step up and take care of their parents. Obviously, it depends on the circumstances. But to make a more extreme example, if adult children just want to shove their parents into some nursing home in which the conditions are deplorable because they don't want to deal with it, then they're avoiding a responsibility in a way that they could be held accountable for. Now, obviously, I'm not saying nursing homes are bad, but what I'm saying is, depending upon what's going on with elderly parents, yes, children, if they can be involved, should try to be involved. If they're not involved because they don't want to, because they kind of enjoy their lifestyle, they want to do whatever they feel like, if they're avoiding responsibility, that's one thing. That's one that where they're going to take more responsibility for, compared to children who may not be able to care for their parents for legitimate reasons. So it really depends on the intentions uh, of the adult children.
Thank you. The next one comes from Yasuo Arakawa. Great talk, Peter. Most of us may be able to retrace back 3 or more generations, and that may tell us about our tendency, like religiosity. The adoptees won't have that data. how big of impact would be in terms of influence or role of family ties in their reincarnation? Leave for next reincarnation?
Okay. Um, so if we can trace our, if we can go back 3 or more generations. I'm sorry, my sound dropped out for a moment, so I didn't hear the whole question at first. So just bear with me here. That may tell us about their tendencies like religiosity. These won't have that data. Times in there. Well, if you have children who are adopted, we don't know what the prior history might have been. So it's possible that, let's say you have a child as adopted, well, that child might have been directly involved in a relationship of some kind with the members of that family in a prior incarnation. So that's one example of how family ties may be at work. And so the impact as far as the role of family ties, again, family ties are driven by emotional relationships. So an adoptee, if they don't necessarily have the same affinity toward the religion that the family has, for example, they may or may not be open to that, or it may be a bit of a struggle. It's hard to say. But depending upon the kind of relationship that an adopted child might have had with members of a family, that could perhaps facilitate more affinity than one might think. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. And yes, we have a couple more that we would like to share with you. The next one, if I'm not mistaken, I'll get to down here. What is the appropriate role of parents once children reach maturity? So it's the opposite
Okay.
now.
Well, I think the short answer, it's not a short answer, but it first of all depends on the child. Are we talking about a child that develops normally? If you have a child that has got developmental issues, autism, for instance, the parents may be involved a lot longer in the child's upbringing for well into adulthood. But if we're talking about children who are fairly healthy and emotionally or functioning fairly normally, the answer, this is more the ideal. Ideally, parents are as hands-on as they can be, in a good way, hands-on, near the beginning of their children's lives, and develop that atmosphere of love, unconditional love, and trust. And the more parents are able to interact with their children, be involved with them early on, and then if that happens, hopefully, children will start to develop so that they feel confident enough that they're able to be more independent when the time is right. So parents have to kind of go through this tricky process of being present in their child's lives, hands-on in the beginning, but then they got to know how to let off the brakes a little bit. Like when their children become teenagers, you observe what's going on, but at the same time, you give them the opportunity to make choices and treat them more like adults, young adults, even though they still need help. And that's assuming that they're not causing lots of problems, that they're involved, that they're very rebellious and doing all kinds of things that are troubling. Then you get into that difficult situation of when to intervene and when not to intervene. And if our children are entering adulthood, you're pretty much at that point where the parents have to begin to accept the choices that their children are making. Much of the time, depends on the circumstances, of course, but as a general rule of thumb, parents have to be more able to accept the choices that their children make, even if they don't agree with them per se, because It's hard for parents to do this, but sometimes if our kids are going to go in a direction where they're liable to mess up, we have to allow that. You can make suggestions, but if parents are trying to control their children when their children are older and mature, or even if they're young adults, that's liable to cause problems, because a lot of times when children feel they're being controlled, they just rebel. Depending on, again, depends on the circumstances, but if parents are too controlling, too inflexible, then children may just do things behind their back and so forth. So it's, again, put simply, it is a combination of being involved early on, but then knowing how to ease up, but stay aware of what's going on and kind of know when to back off and when to try to step in as necessary. Step in, not step in, but just be more like we're here to help if you need us kind of role.
Perfect. Thank you. One final question that I would like to share. This is a kind of intriguing in a way, but it's definitely important for us. And after that, I will go ahead and say a few more words, and then I will certainly invite you to say our final prayer. Antonia Carter says, is there any plan of a child's birth when there is a rape?
Good question. I think well, we don't know for sure what the plan might have been if there was one. It's I would say, generally speaking, that's not something that was planned. We do have free will. But if a child is born and is a result of a rape, that child still needs and deserves to be cared for. So rape, of course, is horrible, and it's not something that God would sanction. But remember, we do have free will. You know, we have free will. People can use their free will to commit crimes. So it's not part of a plan per se. But having said that, there are sometimes compulsory incarnations. So it's not out of the question that maybe it serves a purpose, but I would say, generally speaking, it's not something that's planned. But regardless of that, I think what's more important, though, is that if a child is born and was the result of a rape, that child still needs to be cared for. And that's what the focus should be.
Very well said. I thank you so much once more, and I please accept my thank you, not only coming from me directly, but all the participants of the SSP and everyone who was here with us this afternoon into this evening, sharing their comments and bringing amazing other readings as well, as you mentioned. So please, thank you, and we were extending our gratitude to you, to Betty, who is also jumped in here with us, allowing ourselves to have this amazing moment. So thank you. On that note, Peter, I would like to ask you to say our final prayer, and we will finalize for this evening.
Okay. All right. Let's close our eyes. We thank you, dear God, for your presence. We thank you, Jesus, for your guidance. We are thankful for the opportunities that we have within our families. We're thankful for the opportunities to learn. May all of us receive the support that we need in relation to our families, within our families. May we all receive the support that we need to be able to have as loving a relationship as possible, May all of us be able to be in harmony with our families. And if we can't be, may we be able to practice forgiveness. May we be able to deepen our faith within our families. And if we have an opportunity to reconcile with members of our family, may we have the strength and the courage to do so. If we have love and support in our families, we thank you. And may we be able, all of us, to plant seeds through our family that can be developed in the future. May we be able to develop ongoing spiritual ties and emotional ties in which all of us help one another to grow and to prosper. Amen.